Hello students! In today's video you're going to master perhaps the most popular opening in chess, which is called Sicilian Defense, and it was even used by Magnus Carlsen, the still current world champion, in one of the previous world championships. I'm going to mainly focus on beginners to intermediate level players in today's video. However, if you're very good at chess and you have never played Sicilian, I'm pretty sure that you will get all the fundamentals in order to test it out in your next games. So our opening is going to start after white plays e4 and black is going to play c5, or you're going to be playing c5. Now I will mainly focus on the open Sicilian today. However, I want you to go there and test this new repertoire of yours on chess.com or Lichess right away. So I'll cover a couple of other options as well from white's point of view, just to give you the basics and so that you would be feeling comfortable in playing the games right after this lesson. So let's take a look at knight f3, that's called the open Sicilian, and in general black has quite a few ways to play this. There's the so-called Khan variation with e6, d6 move exists, even a6 move exists, g6 move exists, but we're going to be playing the so-called Sveshnikov variation, which starts with the move knight to c6. So in this position we're expecting white to strike at the center with d4, and they immediately are creating the threat of playing d5. That cannot be allowed. If they get d5, they would kick away our knight. We call this space advantage in chess, and the position for black is not good. So we're going to be taking the pawn on d4, white takes back, and in this position often what white wants to get is the move pawn to c4 and the pony behind it. This way they would increase the amount of pieces they control the center with, and if possible this pawn on c4 with the knight to c3 would be a better setup for white than just with knight c3, or so most of the players think. So what we're going to play is the move knight to f6, which not only develops the piece, but also at the same time we're attacking the pawn on e4 and we're being provocative. We're provoking this knight to come out on c3. So in this position we're going to equalize in space, or at least attempt to equalize in space, which doesn't happen that often for black, to be honest. If we look at the grand scale of openings, we're going to be playing the move e5. So usually white ends up with space advantage, and here we're equalizing that, and we're at the same time hitting the knight. Now, in the Sveshnikov Sicilian variation, the only move really that is a test for black is the move knight to b5. You see, the price that we're paying for this equalization in space that I've mentioned are the weak squares d5, d6, and the weak pawn on d7. Those cannot easily be guarded by pawns anymore for black in the future. So the move knight b5 is very logical because they're immediately attacking this weak square on d6, and if possible they even want to land there. Perhaps at your level they will try a couple of other moves, so I'm just going to show you what happens. For instance, if they go knight to b3, we're going to play bishop b4, black is leading the development, we're pinning the knight and attacking e4. Black's position I think is already better, or we are at least equal. But when chess players say black is at least equal, usually they mean that black is already a little bit better. Another move for white would be knight f5. This looks more aggressive, and we're going to achieve our dream move in this setup or the pawn structure, the move d5. So the idea is that, of course, we're hitting the knight with the bishop, and so when they take on d5, and we can take the knight on f5, usually they take then on c6. We could swap the queens, you could not take the queen, but it is considered that this position is already equal for black. So black is leading the development, and this compensates for some damage in our pawn structure. I don't think you will be having any problems in this position. And at your level, perhaps, white could also think of taking on c6, and here you comfortably take back towards the middle. It increases the amount of pawns you have in the center, and it will even bolster this square d5 where you're going to be putting the pawn a bit later on. So the main move and the big test for us is going to be the move knight to b5 in this position, and so we're going to be playing d6 just so that knight of whites wouldn't be landing on that square d6. So in this position, the most popular move is bishop g5. I will cover only shortly knight d5. They're threatening this fork on c7. Even though that's a legitimate line, the video would just be too long. I have to truncate something, and I chose this line to skip. Nevertheless, I will show you at least a couple of moves here. We're gonna take that pony that is very threatening right now. They're gonna take back, and we're gonna jump back with the knight on to b8, after which later we're gonna get it back to d7. So white usually strengthens the center with the move c4. We can play bishop to e7, for example, here, just casual development. Say bishop e2, castles, castles, finally kicking away the knight. Once again, you see that white has improved their position by having the pawn on c4 instead of c2 with the knight on c3. And after f5, all I could just say that black has a fighting position. Our goal here would be something like e4, place the bishop on f6, have a beautiful knight square, so a square for the knight on e5. And usually black is playing for a win here, and white is also risking to lose the game. Objectively, as everywhere, if white plays correctly, they have to be slightly bit better. At your level, if at all you will get to this position, I believe some of you will for sure, the main move for white is bishop to g5. And the idea of this move is simply to increase the amount of control white has over the square d5. That is usually where the main battle is taking place. This bishop cannot be fighting for the square offensively, so it attempts to remove the defender of that square. So in this position, black usually plays a6. This knight is losing quite a few tempi in the Sveshnikov. So the knight goes back. We're going to be playing b5 and even threaten the fork with b4. And in this position, there is a branch. So white could either go knight to d5 or bishop takes f6. And we're shortly going to look at this. Don't worry if you don't or can't memorize these lines yet. It's absolutely fine. Just watch the video so that you would get some of the fundamental ideas. You're not like 2200, 2300 who is required to know 25, 30 moves of theory. But nevertheless, just try to stay with it so that you would grasp some of the directions that black would be choosing. As after, for example, bishop takes f6, you have to know that very often in Sveshnikov, we're going to be taking with the g pawn, so that you would be surprised by that. So the idea is that often taking with the queen is just a waste of time, even though that keeps the pawn structure solid. White can play knight to d5. You have to go back to defend the forking square here on c7. And after c4, white is developing this initiative. Just look at the amount of pieces that white has developed and threats. There is a big threat on b5 as well now, and you have only the knight developed. So very often this g takes f6, however, is going to help us create counterplay with ideas like f5. Perhaps in some lines we could even use the g file to our advantage. This is an opening where we're going to play for a win. So white often finally puts this knight on d5, where it's not chased away by any of the black's pawns. You could play f5 here with black, which is a nice attempt to remove the defender of the knight, the pawn on e4. Or to some of my students, I recommend the line with bishop g7, which is a little bit simpler. So black just wants to play knight to e7 and not drop the pawn on f6. So the lines, for example, could go like this. Bishop to d3, knight to e7. Now, this is not possible because our bishop is already on g7. They take, castles and castles. And black is going to hit back with the moves d5 or f5. So let's go back a little bit and take a look at the alternative move here, knight to d5, which is equally common compared to bishop takes f6, even maybe a little bit more popular. We have to now unpin ourselves, and white either takes the knight or the bishop with the knight, or the knight with the bishop. So if they take on e7, there's no need to be scared. We often take with the knight, and that's why I say even if you don't memorize concrete moves, you have to remember the ideas that, for example, this pawn structure is absolutely fine. We're going to hit them with f5. Bishop will go to e6 or b7, and usually black still again prepares one of these pawn breaks, d5 or f5. However, very often white just takes on f6. They want to keep this knight on d5, which is right now the best piece that white has. Then they often play also the move c3. The idea behind this is very interesting. Since everything is taking place around the square d5, white can now bring back home the knight from a3 to c2 to e3, so that they would increase the amount of pieces that they can control the d5 with. This would also help them to develop some minority, this would be already a majority attack, isn't it? Nevertheless, the pawn break, which would provoke some weaknesses on the queen side, I'm referring to the move a4, which you're going to see very soon. So, black, for example, castles. Knight is heading towards e3 and opening up the a4 pawn break. Black often plays bishop g5. This is an attempt to keep an eye on the square e3, as well as in the future prepare this move f5. So in this position, very often white doesn't wait and just try to strike right away with a4. As you can see, there is a lot of pressure plus the pin along the a file. So we have positions like this. This pawn was hanging, so we put the pawn on a5 because it's safer. And white is able to strengthen now the square with the bishop. So once the b5 pawn is removed, they're able to play the bishop to c4, which gives just extra protection for the knight on d5. We do not worry, however, as black. Often we play rook b8, b3, and then soon we hit them with f5. And as I say, black very, very often gets fighting positions where white is taking the risk of losing the game. It's not the type of position where you just try to squeeze without allowing any counterplay for your opponent. And I think that's one of the reasons why Magnus Carlsen loved and still loves this opening so much. So this would be your repertoire against the open Sicilian, and I just briefly want to take a look at a few other lines so that you could just go and play this repertoire right now against your opponents on chess.com or Lichess. So knowing my students, very often at your level, opponents may play the move bishop to c4. So here I simply recommend playing e6. The idea behind why this bishop is not so popularly placed on c4 is that it's going to get hit, and they're going to be losing the tempo to move like d5 later or a6, b5. However, once again, knowing my students, I just want to show you one trap or one type of mistake that you may often make, and I don't want you to do that. So let's just imagine white plays a move like knight f3. We play e6 if they prevent us from playing b5, it's fine. We can play the move b6. Often they allow that, say the castle, for instance. We play b5, if bishop b3, we win the bishop with c4, so they would go back. And after bishop b7 and say d3, I don't want you to be making the move d5. You're behind in development. What I want you to rather do is just play something like knight f6, bishop e7, maybe d6 you could include for now, knight c6 and castles. And when you're equally matched in development with the white's army, then I want you to break in the center with this move d5, the red arrow. Very often, if you open up the position when you're behind in development, it will only benefit your opponent, as once the pawns are exchanged, the interactions between your pieces and his pieces are increasing. And since he has more pieces developed, he could start looking at your king, queen, and other pieces, and they will develop tactical opportunities. So just make sure that you don't make this move prematurely. I know that it looks good because it controls the center. Don't do that. And let's take a look at just a few other variations that your opponent can play, because I would be very worried if you didn't know how to react against c3. That would be called the Alapin Sicilian. And the reason why for a lot of my students I recommend this move with white is because in open Sicilian, the moves e6, knight c6, d6, g6 are considered to be the best, one of these moves. However, when they play c3, all of those moves are considered to be not good. And the main moves are d5 and knight f6. So what you have to realize is that when they play this move c3, that's already a different type of Sicilian, and you gotta react against this a little bit differently. So we're going to be playing d5. Normally that's not a good move, but because they cannot hit our queen with the knight, since this c3 square is occupied by their pawn, now actually we can play this move d5, and our queen, at least for now, is safe where she is. So a brief setup. You could have a video of 2 hours long perhaps just on that. So I'm going to give you the fundamentals. One of the setups that we could do is by simply placing the knights on the natural squares. Our light square bishop is going to go to g4 in order to pin the knight and maybe help us exert a little bit more pressure on this pawn d4. Bishop e2, e6, very normal development. And usually when white is playing the move bishop to e3, that is the moment when we have to take, since already they're threatening to win the pawn by taking on c5. There's too much firepower going on there. So what we're going to do is we're going to take on d4, and usually they get this isolated pawn, for example, knight c3 and queen d6, and we have very easy development here. Just simply castles, our rook is going to go to d8, the other one likely to c8. Pawn can go to a6 to stop knight b5 ideas, and you have a typical middle game position against the IQP, the so-called isolated queen's pawn. It might be weird why we choose square d6, like why not d8? It turns out that the only way they could for now win a tempo against the queen is with knight to b5, and it feels like, hey, we have to go back again and move the same piece twice. But once we go to d8, we're going to win the tempo back. Knight cannot do much over here. We're just going to hit it back. And this is when we're going to win that tempo back. So the grandmaster choice in this position would be retreating to d6. And last but not least, briefly, I want to also cover the so-called closed Sicilian. The reason why it's called closed, because very often position doesn't open up as white is not getting this break d4. And the pawn structure is going to be, well, closed. So I'm just going to give you a very easy setup over here. White very often fianchettos their light square bishop like this and play with the move f4. So one interesting thing in the closed Sicilian is that very often we prefer to have this knight on e7, because one of the dream breaks that white is going to get on the king side, that's where they have space, that's where they're going to fight, and that's where they will want to open up the position. So the break that they usually want to go for is f5, since they're going to be hitting 2 pawns, so inevitably they're going to open up the position. e5 is less scary because we have a lot of pressure there, but worst case scenario, we could just push, right? And the position doesn't open up. So this knight on e7 is going to help us to bolster the square f5. It's really not that easy for them to guard it 2 more times. And plus, we're also going to be keeping our dark square bishop open. And since we have the so-called space advantage on the queen side, that's the side where we're going to be playing. So typically we, for example, castle, say bishop e3, and there's this move rook b8, which prepares ideas of b5, b4, maybe the a pawn could also go forward. Very often black is installing this pony on a beautiful square on d4, and black is simply expanding on the queen side. So I think you're ready to try out your Sicilian. If you would like me to go into deeper line, just let me know in the comments. Perhaps I could make a longer video. If you enjoyed the lesson, please consider hiring me as your personal online chess coach. My contacts, I think, should be on the right of the screen. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next class. Bye-bye.